Welcome to No Occasion to Shout. Today we have a guest, Isaac, and we are going to be talking about vaccines. And as you can see, since we have three people, the way that our software works, we only have a limited time of 40 minutes, so we're going to go kind of quickly and just jump right into things. Isaac, why don't you introduce yourself and explain to us why you're here?
It's good to be here, Austin. Thanks for having me. So the reason I'm here is actually because of my brother. A few months ago, he decided to get his vaccines when he turned 18, and there's this big viral joke going around. That's the new cool thing. Instead of sneaking out to get alcoholic shots, you sneak out to get your vaccine shots, and that's like a new phase, I guess. So there's some pretty funny memes about it. But anyway, my brother did that. He got vaccinated. His name's Linderberger. And since he did that, he kind of became an internet sensation. He got interviews all over the country, became kind of international news. Then 3 weeks after this whole thing transpired, he was invited to speak at the U.S. Senate.
I'm already confused. He got on news because he did some vaccines? What?
Yeah.
What did I miss?
Yeah, that's what I said, dude. Like, that's exactly
Everybody
what we all
gets vaccines all the time. What was the news story about?
Oh, well, that's a good point. The reason why it was a news story is because our mom is anti-vax. And so I personally think it was a way to try to fight anti-vaccine propaganda from the government's perspective so that they had a personalized reason to do so with an example that somebody who didn't have his vaccines because of his mom's perspectives then decides to get them. So it's like a real-world embodiment of something that they're trying to express on a global scale.
How did anybody find out about that, and who were the first media outlet to get in touch?
So, well, the reason why is because he posted it on Reddit. So he was actually confused about the actual logistics of the whole scenario. He didn't really have anybody to tell him, this is where you get vaccinated, this is how much it costs, blah, 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 blah. So he posted it on Reddit. I guess that's a popular place for teenagers to turn their advice. I've asked for Reddit a few times. You guys know Bitcoin and stuff like that. I have gone to them to help me set up my mining rig, and it worked out great. I actually found this dude who I offered him money, Bitcoin, and he did it for free. I was worried he was going to hack my stuff, but it turns out he was legit. So it seems to be
hold on. What was your brother getting vaccinated for, or against, I should say?
He got all of his vaccines. So he got vaccinated against polio, tetanus,
the standard ones.
Right, mumps, rubella, all that kind of stuff.
Yeah, all right.
He got all the standard vaccines. And so Reddit was like very supportive. Some people offered him money to go get the vaccines. So that went really well. And since
Why?
I don't know.
They're trying to get rid of the anti-vax propaganda.
Not at this point, though. At this point, it was just limited to my brother, right? So at this point, it was just like a fellow doctor or nurse that thought, oh, you brave kid, I'll help you personally. And then somebody in the news, so I'm glad you brought that up because that's where it led from. Somebody in the news on Reddit must have seen it or something, and he got invited to do a local Fox News interview. And then when he went to do that, it just kind of like dominoed, like a spiral chain of reaction that still hasn't stopped. I thought his 5 minutes of fame was going to be done 3 months ago, and it's still going on. Next month he speaks at the United Nations. So
just because he got vaccines done and his mum is against getting vaccines.
Yeah, that's it.
So hold on. I'm trying to understand this. So he's going to the United Nations to say what everybody's been saying and known for decades, which is, get vaccines, man, they're cool. Like, they work. Or, like, is that what he's going?
That's right. Because his mom was anti-vax, and they want to hit that target group individually. So when he went to the Senate, right, I went with him.
You would think the United Nations has got better things to do.
Yeah, I'm a little bit concerned. I really wanted to go myself, actually, because I wanted to get kicked out of the UN, too, because I almost got kicked out of the Senate. I was wearing a purple gradient lavender T-shirt, and I stand up after Rand Paul speaks, and I applaud. Everyone else is wearing this boring, dull gray. I'm in, like, this psychedelic vibration. Then the Then the cop's like, you're not going anywhere, son. And I was like, I'm not trying to go anywhere, all right? I just sat down, and it was at
You're not
11:11
supposed to stand up?
Crazy.
You weren't supposed to stand up?
I guess a standing ovation's against the law in D.C., man. I never knew. But I found out directly, so that was kind of nice. So once that happened, dude, I got a very large anti-vaccine following, actually. But I never said I was anti-vaccine, actually.
No. So we're missing bits of this story. You got an anti-vaccine following. Why? Because you applauded a speech that was against vaccines?
Well, here's the thing, though. Rand Paul's speech wasn't actually against vaccines. It was for liberty. So he actually promoted vaccines in the speech. He said that he thinks that they're good and all that stuff. But during the speech, he also said that the individual has the right to choose.
Yeah, right.
So I applauded that, and afterwards I came outside and I talked to people. They tried to not let me. They were like, Isaac, we're going to the back. And I was like, sure. And I went to follow them, and I twisted around and ran out the door. And then I started talking to people, and they liked my pro-liberty stance. And so they kind of all assumed that I was anti-vaccine, and the whole thing escalated from that. But that's kind of what happened with the whole Senate meeting.
Okay. So we probably agree on a lot of things. There's just kind of that one question that I've talked to a lot of people about that I think is a conversation to be had, which is, where do you draw the line in terms of, have you ever heard of the phrase negative liberty?
Negative? I have not heard it. What does that mean?
It means that, Robin, you actually explain this a lot better than I do. Do you want to explain it?
All right. Well, there's negative rights and positive rights. And a negative right is the right to be free from something. Positive right is the supposed right to do or have something, right? And most liberty folks would say there is no such thing as let's say most American libertarians, let's put it that way, would say there's no such thing as a positive right. There are only negative rights. And so I think that's what Austin's referring to. So you have a right to be free from any imposition. You have the idea that you can have a positive right to impose anything is a contradiction in terms. So I think where Austin's going with that is you have an inherent, natural, negative right to not have somebody put something inside your body, which seems pretty obvious to me. But is that where you're going with that, Austin?
There's that argument, and then the reverse with the smoking. Should it be legal to smoke? Because if you're smoking, you're causing secondhand smoke and then putting others in danger. So is there, in order to protect people's liberties, is it appropriate for the government to say, okay, you cannot smoke in public areas? So hold
on. So since you bring up that example, let's tie it up. So somebody has a negative right not to have to breathe your smoke if it's harming them and they don't want to. So for example, in Britain, just a year or two ago, they passed a law that criminalized the smoking in a car with a child in the car. The child not being able to consent to the health impact of, being in basically a metal box with a bunch of nicotine. So
Isaac, what would be your thoughts on that, on the banning smoking in the car with the child?
So I think that the intention's great. I think that the heart of the issue, it makes sense if you deal with it with government legislation and the problem is solved. And if only that was the case. But unfortunately, I don't think that the intervention of government regulations actually solves the moral issue that you're trying to get to when it comes to the base. So you have the good morals, but you don't really have the good solution when it comes to resorting to government legislation. So I would say I would be against the legislation for that, because I think that it would actually do more harm than good, like most government regulations. And I would propose alternative measures to discourage people from smoking in their cars and encourage them to accept the rights of the children and maybe even other adults who are also in their car. They can't consent to being around that toxic environment. It reminds me kind of like abortion. You can be against abortion morally. That's fine. It's totally 100% fine. If you're talking to someone about the issue, they're probably not going to sway on that position. But a lot of people conflate it with wanting it to be illegal if you believe that it's immoral. But you can have the position that it's not moral, but still be in support of it being legal, because then it goes underground if it's not, and a bunch more women die, and it just gets all nasty. So I would say that I wouldn't propose the government using violence and coercion to solve the issue, because it's like almost feeding fire with fire to get rid of the first one. But you could encourage nonviolent solutions in a voluntary way that really gets at the heart of the moral issue and has a lasting solution that isn't solved by giving people tickets and stuff like that. So I like the idea, but I don't think that legislation is the correct solution.
What if I told you that the legislation actually has worked?
Based off of some statistical measures?
Yeah.
I would find that interesting. I would also like to see the actual statistics about the health effects that have been, this many less children are being diagnosed with early lung cancer or something like that. And if that was the case, then that would be interesting, because it has to change your perspective. Because while I'm against government in general, I'm not necessarily against people voluntarily consenting to the rules that they're governed by. And so when that kind of thing happens, then you can be in support of a certain rule or law that is actually moral and actually functions appropriately and is efficient. So when it comes to that kind of thing, I would say, well, then I would sign up to be followed by it. But I wouldn't necessarily say that just because it works, I have the right to force somebody else to do that as well.
Hold on a second, though. You would only be forcing somebody, let's say you buy the intent and let's say the effectiveness of the legislation. This particular example, you're not forcing anybody to do anything. You're preventing them from causing direct harm to somebody that cannot protect themselves. Isn't that, if there's any legitimate actions by government, isn't that legitimate?
I would say yes. That I would say based off of what government is supposed to be, that would be one of the things that it should do, because theoretically it should represent the rights of the people who can't defend themselves. And since it's a monopoly on force and violence in a given territory, then that would be one of the best applications of that monopoly.
Okay. So I guess it just depends on the individual with the law. If they are banning smoking in cars, it would have to, in the minds of all the individuals that are in the society, they will have to think, wow, that is a law now. I never considered how harmful that was for my child. That is a big deal. I should not do that. Or on the contrary, they could think that is a ridiculous law. I'm not going to think of that. But the ability, I guess that what's in question is the ability for the law to force citizens in a society to rethink the moral actions and the severity of them.
I like that point a lot, actually, because then it gets to the issue of, well, we're not actually fixing the problem by throwing people in cages and arresting them, but by changing the collective consciousness perspective of something, by putting the idea out there through legislation. And you can do it through other ways, which is what I was trying to promote in the first place. Like government legislation is like the last resort. Like if people are dying everywhere and that's your only chance, then okay, maybe it's worth a try. But first, pro-education programs, pro-social media activism programs, other stuff to be able to change people's perspective. But if it works, I guess it works.
Yeah, I would mostly agree with that. How about in cases like measles, where we look at the data before vaccinations existed, widespread problems. After vaccination existed, virtually non-existent. Do you think there are any vaccines in certain cases that should be, at least from the perspective maybe of what I said before, the collective people realizing what a big deal it is, should be considered mandatory?
Well, it depends on what you mean by considered mandatory, because when you think about the collective consciousness having a perspective that maybe it should be mandatory, as in you should have to do it or else we're screwed, but you don't actually get, have a gun held to your head and you actually have to do it. I know it's not actually that extreme, but that's what happens in the long run. Like there's this thing going on in New York with the measles outbreak, actually. and unvaccinated kids are being prevented to actually leave their homes, but it got overturned at the Supreme Court. So then they actually started going house to house to make sure people were vaccinated or whatever. I mean, I get the idea, but it's honestly totalitarian, and there's a slippery slope when you have government making legislation on these kind of mandates. So I get what you guys are saying, because there's a libertarian argument for being pro-vaccine mandate, saying that, well, if you're a biological health hazard, then you're violating the non-aggression principle, because you're aggressing against other individuals who wouldn't be able, like the kid in the cart, otherwise able to protect themselves. But
I've got it. Just to that point, I just want to be clear that I would not make that argument. I don't think that's fair.
Okay.
I think this is a fundamentally different situation from the kid in. Let me put it this way: a different situation on principle from the kid in the car. So I just want to put my point of view out there on that, just in case anybody's listening to this and they get the wrong.
Gotcha.
Where I am. But you carry on. You carry on, sir.
Sorry. I think I maybe misinterpreted what you guys are going into. One second, this lawnmower is really loud.
We've never had a lawnmower on the show before.
I just wrote a rap, actually, and I put mowing the lawn in it, and it's absolutely hilarious. Well, that's getting released in a few months, so it has to be perfect. But anyway, so like I was saying, when it comes to the moral argument with being pro-libertarian and pro-vaccine mandates, I like what Ron Paul had to say on the issue. So the moral argument makes sense, just like
Ron or Rand, just to clarify.
Ron Paul said this. So if you believe the traditional narrative about vaccines, then the whole thing makes sense. So we'll talk within that paradigm. But what Ron Paul said was really nice. So when you start mandating an individual's sovereignty for medical freedom, so you make their medical choices, like when it comes to vaccinations, to protect others, right? That's the whole point. That's where it starts. How long before we're arresting people for not washing their hands or not coughing in their shoulder because they're a potential health hazard to others around them? The government, when it gets an inch, it takes a mile. And we have historical precedents that show that in any history textbook you could ever find. Two examples are the Patriot Act going into the Military Commission Act of 2006, which took away a lot of government rights, individual liberties, I should say. Now due process isn't even a thing if you're considered a terrorist. And also you have the example of taking away reasonable gun restrictions and then going into gun grabbing. So when it starts with, well, we have to convince everyone that these vaccines need to be mandated, then it goes into, well, what else do we need to convince them of that's important for the general safety, before the individual can't even make any medical choices for themselves? I know it's a stretch, but that is where it starts. We need to make sure that we're dealing with these issues without resorting to government legislation in the first place.
And I would add to that, for me, the fundamental element of this situation is that oftentimes the received medical wisdom is wrong. And at various points in history, individuals that know more than, let's say, the medical establishment can be right on a particular issue where the establishment is wrong. Malaria is a great historical example. There are others, right? Semmelweis was the guy that was all for washing hands between operations, and the medical profession laughed at him, but he was, saving lives. Et cetera, et cetera. I'm it's probably dangerous by coming out and saying this, but back in the day when the AIDS thing hit off, the 80s into the 90s, I was very interested in the science of that. I'm a scientist by training. And I was convinced that a lot of the received wisdom on, the HIV/AIDS thing was wrong, to the point that my choice would have been, my choice was that if I, with a sexual partner, I would say to them, I don't want you to get an HIV test on my account. And that was because of what I believed I knew. And if someone came at me with a needle to do something to me that I knew was premised on bad science, as far as I'm concerned, that's an act of violence. And that is an act of violence, whether my knowledge is right or wrong. And, the fundamental danger is that there's some establishment who is the idea that there's some establishment, medical or political, that knows the truth on the issues and can determine what is the healthy thing to mandate. That's
Right.
terrifying. I mean, that's just George Orwell. You come at me with a bloody needle. You putting something inside my body. If that isn't violence, I don't know what is. And I imagine being a parent, looking at the government doing what I see harm by putting something inside my child. I think I would shoot to stop that. And I can't imagine where we're going if we would shoot back to stop that parent shooting the person with the needle. I just can't imagine where society ends up. So, I do see those. I've got quite strong feelings about that too.
Okay, but if we do look at all the science of vaccines, if we look at all the data, for example, from 1963 to 1968, there were 520,217 cases of measles. And then after the vaccinations were introduced, there were 55 cases of measles. So at least in that, from that data, you can tell that after vaccinations were introduced, the cases went down significantly. Is that not, I think that's substantiated evidence. Is there a difference between substantiated evidence and unsubstantiated evidence in terms of vaccinations?
Of course. I mean, there's a difference between when it comes to certain claims that you're making about the efficiency and safety about vaccines, but the data that proves that it's healthy and safe or whatever, even if it was 100%, right? And we knew for solid, let's say there's even not any anti-vaxxers, everyone trusts that vaccines are safe and efficient, I would still be against mandating them. Because not only does that have the threats to individual sovereignty like we were describing earlier when the government can continue to transgress on individual liberties, it also reduces public faith in vaccinations. If it gets to the point that the government has to force you to do it, then what's actually wrong with the whole thing? So it makes people question about the actual safety because government is mandating it and making it to where you have to do it. Cigarettes aren't even illegal, and they're definitely bad for you. So I think that it just makes people too skeptical.
What about seatbelts? Do you think seatbelts should be illegal to not wear a seatbelt?
No, absolutely not. I think that you should wear a seatbelt, and I highly encourage it. But actually, that's a great point, because since the implementation of the law to wear seatbelts, I actually know quite a few people who now choose not to flex their anarchist vibe. As they said to me once, it's actually what they said. So, but actually, if you look at the law, more people now wear their seatbelts, interestingly enough. So then, it looks like it worked. But seatbelts are a little bit of a different thing than an injection. You know what I mean? Nobody's really questioning. No one thinks that they're trying to cut off our heads with seatbelts or anything. You know what I mean? Well, vaccines are more touchy. So when it comes to that kind of thing, if the government does mandate it, it's really going to hurt their case. And usually it does when government legislation gets involved and interacting in the situation. So really the best solution is actually proactive education for both sides to initiate a constructive conversation that allowed truth to enter the dialogue honestly, rather than having it kind of force its way in there when it's not really wanted. And then who knows if it's actually that because it forced its way in there. It's like if you have a guest that you invite into your home or one that breaks down the door. Which one are you going to trust more? Probably the one that knocked. And then if they do knock, then you're more likely to keep that position for the rest of your life and spread that to others as well.
Who should be paying for the education? Should this be education by government through public schools? Because if so, aren't we back to the same problem?
Well, I don't even think public school should exist to begin with. I think that public school, it's not educating. It's more like salviating the Pavlovian bell.
Okay, so take public schools out of that question then. Let's just say the education that the government wants or needs to do to get people to, let's say, vaccinate their kids or wear seatbelts. Should they be able to do that, given that they're going to have to fund it, and they're going to fund it by probably taxation, which is force? Legit?
Taxation? No, taxation is absolutely theft. have. So the actual way that they fund that is the government doesn't do anything at all, and you let the private sector take care of it, because the private sector is about 10 times more efficient. Have a blockchain initiative start, and then through the profits of the blockchain, then you can spread information like on Steam and Mines, and then it never can be deleted or go away, so then you've got it forever.
Okay. So when I hear what you're saying with the argument, from my perspective, this sounds a lot like, this is going to be ironic, but it sounds like communism. It sounds like something that works efficiently, idealistically, or on paper, but it's not pragmatic in terms of the way that society works. So if we have a very large majority percent of people, for example, that all agree that, hey, we should have roads, and everyone is willing to put into the system, then you could argue that there should be privatization of roads, so someone should start a private service to make the roads better. But are you arguing that if given the opportunity to press a button and get rid of government and let everything just spontaneously occur by itself, that you would push that button? Because I would make the argument that government is kind of a spontaneous order that is always going to reoccur, because there's going to be such a large group of individuals that agree with schools, police, libraries, things like that, that it's always going to just spontaneously occur back to the same type of government thing. And I think that's kind of pragmatic, and I think that's in the real world, so to speak, is something that's inevitably going to happen.
Okay, sorry, you kind of cut in and out there, but I got the gist of the argument. So I appreciate your pragmatism, and I think that it is realistic historically. However, I don't think that it's realistic proactively. So government does spontaneously form because there are not alternative systems that exist to actually serve the function that the public sector serves, because it has a monopoly, not only on force and violence with the military and the police, but has a monopoly on the creation and subjugation of road production and construction. It has a monopoly on the public services that you would otherwise find in the private sector, but don't, because government has realmed it its territory. So there's this concept called agorism. The agora is the free market. And agorism is basically creating private sector policies and structures, infrastructure, that make the government's public services inept. So when the government eventually collapses or whatever, these private systems that are based off of competition more effectively solve the problems that government offers to solve without the actual initiation of force to do it, because good ideas don't require force. And so this is actually a blueprint for a voluntary society that would work now when it wouldn't before, because government has kind of been embedded into human consciousness as the way to deal with these problems. And I think that we needed it when we had it. You know what I mean? Because it did serve those functions, but it also created a lot of problems. Now I think we're getting to the evolutionary state that we could handle a privatized, voluntary system of government that's on a localized and decentralized scale, just like with cryptocurrency. Great example. Bitcoin and all that kind of stuff is making fiat currency inept. And there's also startup societies, seasteads. There's examples like Liberland, which is a country in Europe that has its own libertarian government kind of thing. And these things are actually working. So I think that by supporting them, you're actually helping the world come to a place where it doesn't need government any longer. So I think that you have a good case for the historical side of that, but I think that it's going the other direction, at least from what I can see.
Okay, that's a fair point. Robin, anything to say to that?
Oh, as always, there's so many great points here that we could make an hour out of each of them. One thing that did occur to me that I think kind of applies to many of the kind of issues that we're talking about is that there's actually a long way between individual. There's a big gap between complete individual choice and absolute government mandate backed by the force of law. I don't know if you've read that book called Nudge, where they talk about the way that you present alternatives to people massively affects how the choices they make. So, for example, with respect to the let's say the vaccines, right? You can have a system. This would be the first thing I would say a quick yes to. I'm not saying it's the optimal solution, but it's a good solution. Maybe would be okay. Have a system where there's a process in place where everybody gets vaccinated. All the kids get vaccinated at whatever age. The procedure's in place. It's very simple and efficient, and the expectation is set. The cultural norm is set. But you can opt out. So the point is, you don't make the positive choice to do it. There's the system in place, and you have a completely free choice to opt out. Now, you maintain all of your freedom. There's no cost to opting out, but it harnesses psychological inertia in the right direction. And it's astonishing the impact of that. One of the places this has been implemented massively, with massive effect, is in Scandinavia, where everybody is an organ donor, unless you opt out. So, and a blood donor, right? So if you die, your organs are donated as a matter of course, but everybody can opt out. Now, just because it's an opt-out system and not an opt-in system, they have massively more organ donation and massively more lives saved. And this works in domain after domain after domain. So the freedom is maintained, but the presentation is different. Norms are presented differently. So this is, and it's actually called kind of like nudge philosophy, or the nudge method. And I'm as a kind of a liberty guy who wants things to work rather than just bang on kind of philosophical arguments that don't do anything. It has a certain appeal to me as an approach.
That's very interesting. Thanks for telling me about that. It's actually right up my alley. I just put it in my sticky notes, actually.
Well, then you want to buy that book. Nudge is the name of the book, which goes into it.
Got it. See, that's really useful because it takes the difference that we were talking about just 1 second ago between where the historical precedence has been with government, where we want it to go. That kind of sounds like the bridge in between, between those two realms. So, yeah, that's actually really what needs to be focused on more, because you can talk on Facebook all day about the perfect ideological solution to anything, but implementing it, that's the thing that you have to really worry about.
Here. How are we doing for time, Austin?
How do you feel? We are at 33 minutes, so we have about 7 minutes left. So, Isaac, how do you feel about the Nordic system, which some people call Nordic socialism and some people call Nordic capitalism, which essentially, from a philosophical standpoint, kind of puts government in competition with the free market. So there exists a competition between both realms.
I absolutely love it. I think that that's actually a way to make government more in check with the things that it provides, because since it has the monopoly on the public sector, it doesn't have the incentive to improve. And competition in a capitalistic society is the basis for evolution and improvement. But when government isn't applied to that, maybe we know why our public restrooms are so much worse than the private ones. But that's one small example, but it actually does apply into a broader scale when you see that public sectors are remarkably inefficient compared to their private counterparts. So I think that by making that competition in check with the public sector, but not giving it entirely to the private region, because there are some benefits to having a public sector, like having public property, for example, is a good one, like a historical monument or something. We shouldn't really be privatizing the Abe Lincoln Memorial. It doesn't really make much sense. But putting that kind of structure in competition would make it to where you could still keep some of the public sector's value and essence while giving it the incentive to improve. So I like it.
Yeah, I like it too. And I would say I like the fact that public schools exist because it, in the United States, for example, because it gives private schools something to be compared to. It gives a legitimacy to public versus private competition.
That's a good point, actually.
And have you heard of LeBron James's school that he opened? That's kind of like a blend between a public and a private school.
No, I haven't. Ron James?
LeBron James. He's a
LeBron?
basketball player.
Oh, yeah,
he
LeBron.
opened the
Okay.
school.
I didn't know he did that.
Yeah, it's called the I Promise School. It's really interesting. It's I think it's like 60 or 70% funded by the state, and then 30% funded by him. However, the catch is he gets a lot of say into what happens and what the criteria are and what is taught and what programs are there. And that was the and I thought, yeah, and apparently I just read an article that said that the test scores were promising or higher than most of the other public schools. I just kind of read the headline. I didn't really read it, but I thought it was a interesting type of thing, and it reminded me of the Nordic system. Robin, what are your thoughts on the Nordic system?
There's a lot of fundamental things that the non-Nordic people don't get about the Nordic system that largely determine a lot of the results, especially the results that people like. And one of the important things is that in Scandinavian countries, they actually have the best property right protections of any countries in the world, including the United States, including the English-speaking world. So whilst they have a massively redistributive state, like you could call it a large welfare state, what's interesting about that is that more than any other nations, the Scandinavian nations let the wealth creation leave it completely in the hands of private citizens. Private property rights are so well protected. So what you actually have is wealth creating processes heavily privatized and individualized, right? But once the wealth is created, then the government steps in a big way. And I think the lesson that Scandinavia has for the world is that if the state is gonna interfere, you want it interfering less in the means. Like the simplest interference of like, thanks for making all that wealth, we're gonna take some, is actually less problematic when it comes to rights and prosperity than interfering in how you create the wealth, right? Business regulation, the details, private property, land rights, etc., very strongly protected in the Scandinavian countries. So that's one thing to say. And the other thing to say is that, and this is the most fascinating thing, this was blew my mind when I discovered this, about Scandinavian, let's say, political culture, which is they have an idea of liberty that they are as passionate about as many, and individual liberty as Americans, but it has a different meaning for them. They see the state as having a critical role in protecting individual liberty by making sure that every choice that an individual makes isn't biased by their circumstances. So, for example, the state sees it as a pro-individual liberty act of the state to ensure that a wife has enough money, wealth, that she is not staying with a husband because she needs the roof over her head. So now what that actually means is there's a massive redistribution going on. The state is atomizing the society, right? It's actually making individuals more isolated from each other than in the United States. For them, in Scandinavia, in certain Scandinavian countries, in Sweden, for example, they see that massive state intervention, we would perhaps identify as a massive state intervention, as necessary to secure, in a very pure sense, individual liberty. And so it's a completely different conception. It's kind of a statist conception of individual liberty. But it's no less about...
That's crazy.
It is crazy. And until we understand, this is a real paradigm thing, right? Because you've got Americans judging, we don't like Scandinavian socialism. Oh, we do like Scandinavian capitalism, whatever. But the thing is, we're missing the fundamental point about what that actually is for them. So that's a really interesting show to be done.
Wow. All right, that's 40 minutes, but we're still here.
Well, we better stop recording because it's going to go like that if we don't.
Awesome. Well, thanks for having me on, guys. A lot of really interesting points. Now I have a new book to read. I'm almost finished with, let's see, like 4 others.
That's how it goes. Thanks
All
for
right,
coming on the
thank you
show.
guys
And thanks for arranging this, Austin.
No problem. And in the comments, tell us what you think about the idea, the opt out method, which I think is a good idea. What you think of that, and about the Nordic system, which is kind of a weird mix of capitalism and socialism that I personally like better than the system we have in the U.S. now. But it is very confusing and interesting. What do you think about the Nordic system, guys? Tell us, and make sure to like, comment, and subscribe.